Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm so grateful, as always, to be part of a community like Moscow that values both literature and social engagement. And this is a really incredible crowd here for this launch. And thank you so much to Carol, as always, for supporting local authors and projects and literature more generally, making this wonderful space. And I'm thrilled to have all of the readers and speakers who you'll hear from, who will be introducing themselves, involved. There was an outpouring of people who wanted to be involved, and we've got the Latah County Brady chapter here with some amazing material that they'll be talking to you about that I also really encourage you to stay after and look at that display and talk to them as well. Unfortunately, the representative for Alternatives to Violence of the Palouse is sick tonight, so they are not represented. They couldn't find somebody last minute, so they're apologetically not here. So this anthology officially published yesterday. So this is the very first reading in the country. More yay, Moscow. And it is the culmination of 2.5 years' work by my co-editors Brian Clements and Dean Rader and me, and with all the poets and respondents in the book, and with Beacon Press, all of whom donated their time to this project so these voices could be gathered together and published. The original impetus for this project was honestly my own sorrow and frustration at a string of shootings in 2015. Of course, mass shootings have been going on since long before that and have continued since, but there was a particular period that year over several months when every Friday, which is my writing day, when I would go to try to sit down and write, there seemed to be news of another mass shooting, and I found that I wasn't able to think or write about anything else. As many of you know, my second book of poetry, The Wise and Foolish Builders, focused largely on the legacy of the Winchester Gun Company in this country, so this is a subject that's already been of great concern to me for years, but during that time I was feeling particularly as though I wanted to be able to take some kind of further action, and part of what I was seeing is that there were so many incredible poems that were being written in response to these tragedies and circulated on social media, and I felt as though those poems were both giving solace, at least a bit of solace after the tragedies, but also putting some different language to conceptualizing what was happening in this country, this epidemic of violence, beyond what sometimes becomes just this very polarized debate, I think, in the media. I never tire of quoting Wallace Stevens saying that poetry should be the imagination pressing back against the pressures of reality. And I think these poems are an important way of pressing back against what may start to seem the horrifyingly inevitable reality in this country. So at that point, near the end of 2015, I reached out to the poet and editor Dean Rader, who I know from the Bay Area of California, to see if he would be interested in collaborating on editing such an anthology. And he suggested that we also reach out to his friend Brian Clements, whose wife was a teacher at Sandy Hook during the shootings there 5 years ago this month. And she lived, and their children were on lockdown at a school down the street, and the whole family has dedicated themselves in the past 5 years, largely to gun violence prevention. And so Brian and Dean and I gathered all of the poems that we knew on this subject and also started reaching out to poets, many of whom had work on the subject already or wanted to write on it. So we got this outpouring of really powerful work. And I think that the number of poets already concerned with this subject is certainly also testament to how epidemic this is in the country. And because Brian has done all this work in gun violence prevention, he was able to reach out to activists in the movement, to people who have lost family members to gun violence, to people who have survived shootings themselves, and to gather responses as well. And we had this idea of creating a sort of call and response in the book, which is a sort of atypical structure for a poetry anthology, but really adds, I think, to the sense that we want this to be a conversation, and we want it to not further polarize this subject, but help people to have new ways of talking about what's happening. So there are responses in the book from everybody from Gabrielle Giffords to Tamir Rice's mother, Samira Rice. And I will read you one of those responses in a moment, but I wanted to start by reading you one of the first poems that made me think of this kind of anthology. And it was a poem that I've kept going back to in the years since and that I find incredibly powerful. And this is for Tamir Rice, and it's by Mark Doty. It's called In 2 Seconds. Tamir Rice, 2002, 2014. The boy's face climbed back down the 12-year tunnel of its becoming, a charcoal sunflower swallowing itself. Who has eyes to see or ears to hear? If you could see what happens fastest, unmaking the human irreplaceable, a star falling into complete gravitational darkness from all points of itself, all this, the held, loved body into which entered milk and music, honeying the cells of him, who sang to him, stroked the nap of the scalp, kissed the flesh knot after the cord completed its work of fueling into him the long history of those whose suffering was made more bearable by the as yet unknown of him, playing alone in some unthinkable future city, a Cleveland, whatever that might be. 2 seconds to elapse, the arc of joy in the conception bed, the labor of hands repeated until the hands no longer required attention, so that as the woman folded her hopes for him sank into the fabric of his shirts and underpants, down they go, swirling down into the maw of a greater dark, treasure box, comic books, pocket knife, bell from a lost cat's collar. Why even begin to enumerate them, when behind every tributary poured into him comes rushing backward all he hasn't been yet. Everything that boy could have thought or made, sung or theorized, built on the quavering but continuous structure that had preceded him, sank into an absence in the shape of a boy playing with a plastic gun in a city park in Ohio in the middle of the afternoon. When I say 2 seconds, I don't mean the time it took him to die. I mean the lapse between the instant the cruiser braked to a halt on the grass, between the moment and the one in which the officer fired his weapon, the 2 seconds taken to assess the situation. And though I believe it is the work of art to try on at least the moment and skin of another, for this hour I respectfully decline. I refuse it. May that officer be visited every night of his life by an enormity collapsing in front of him into an incomprehensible bloom, and the voice that howls out of it. If this is no poem, then, but that voice, erased boy, beloved of time, who did nothing to no one and became nothing because of it, I know that voice is one of the things we call poetry. It isn't to his killer he's speaking. Before I turn the stage over to the other readers and speakers, I did, as I said, want to read one of the responses as well. And this is the response to the poem that gives this anthology its title. And you'll hear that poem near the end of the reading before Bob Wrigley reads his poem from the anthology. So we have double Moscow connection to this anthology. I also do have a poem in here, but I chose to read Mark Doty's instead. But this is in response to Martina Spada's poem, Heal the Cracks in the Bell of the World. And this is by David and Francine Wheeler, the parents of Ben Wheeler, who was killed at Sandy Hook. And they have since founded an organization called Ben's Lighthouse. And I wanted to read this because I think it speaks to my motivations and understanding for the role that poetry and these kinds of community gatherings can have, and my co-editor's views on this as well. And so David and Francine Wheeler say, in the period following the murder of our son, this poem was read at several gatherings, and at one I, David, spoke the words myself. We feel the irony of the location of our loss, Connecticut, the birthplace of the American firearms industry, Newtown, the home of that industry's trade group. Nearby Waterbury, the former brass foundry of the country where furnaces melted brass to make bells, shifting their production to shell casings for the war effort. New Haven, home of Eli Whitney, who advanced the mass production of firearms more than anyone. To move through this landscape day after day, carrying the weight of our murdered boy in the hole in our hearts, just his shape and size, is an unwanted permanent texture of our lives. It is, however, eclipsed in dimension by the support, assistance, and love of our community tucked in these same hills, a community where we work to support, teach, and help others through the organization Ben's Lighthouse created to honor Ben, his classmates, and his teachers, working to heal wherever we can. Helping is healing, so we stay and we listen for the bells.
My name is Jessie Bo Miller. I'm a poetry candidate in the MFA Creative Writing Program, and really proud to be working with people that are doing such important work. When Alexandra asked us if we would read and to look over the book, it's a hard book to read, but it's an important book to read. And I chose the poem that I did by Tara Bray because I'm a mother of 3 children, and when I hear about gun violence, I often think of the way that it affects families. How my mother died. My father shook the gun to get the bullet out. He was a careless man, but only once. I shouldn't linger on this. The road rising out of itself, my father out on Pine Street in the dark, down on all fours, trying to open up his face with gravel, trying to get down to the tar of what went wrong by making blood again. They find him there in a dream of twigs thrashing in the heat, every stitch of light withheld. Jesus of the ordinary prayer, lay my father down on a bed of straw and let him bleed his way to light. Give him one sweet hour of oblivion for all of us. He's out there groveling in the glare of suspicion, burrowing into the deep red pit where the lowest sounds are made. He's borrowed his life from brambles that wait to burn. I know the dirt won't hide our family, and the sun's intensity won't take root in the sky, make truth a thing we all can see. So let my father drift away from here, holding your brown feet. Stir your crown of glory into his bleary eyes and sing the untroubled prayer, the warm treason of innocence. Ready us both for the undoing that can't, for the life of him, be undone.
Hi, I'm Tobias Ray. I'm the director of creative writing at the University of Idaho. And thank you, Alexandra, for pulling together this beautiful and important work that I think it is beautiful for how many voices have come together to talk about this. The 2 poems I chose to read both are from the perspective of queer men the morning after the Pulse shooting in Orlando, which is, if you can believe it, that's just a year and a half ago today. A Poem for Pulse by Jamison Fitzpatrick. Last night I went to a gay bar with a man I love a little. After dinner we had a drink. We sat in the far back of the big backyard, and he asked, "What will we do when this place closes?" "I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon," I said, though the crowd was slow for a Saturday. And he said, "Yes, but one day, where will we go?" He walked me the half-block home and kissed me goodnight on my stoop, properly, not too quick, close enough our stomachs pressed together in a second sort of kiss. I live next to a bar that's not a gay bar. We just call those bars, I guess. And because it is popular and because I live on a busy street, there are always people who aren't queer people on the sidewalk on weekend nights. Just people, I guess. They were there last night. As I kissed this man, I was aware of them watching and of myself wondering whether or not they were just. But I didn't let myself feel scared. I kissed him exactly as I wanted to, as I would have without an audience. Because I decided many years ago to refuse this fear, an act of resistance. I left the idea of hate on the stoop and went inside to sleep, early and drunk and happy. While I slept, a man went to a gay club with 2 guns and killed 49 people. Today, in an interview, his father said he had been disturbed recently by the sight of 2 men kissing. What a strange power to be cursed with, for the proof of men's desire to move men to violence. What's a single kiss? I've had kisses no one has ever known about, so many kisses without consequence, but there is a place you can't outrun, whoever you are. There will be a time when it might be a bullet, suddenly. The sound of it, many, one man, 2 guns, 50 dead, 2 men kissing. Last night I can't get away from imagining it, them, the people there to dance and laugh and drink, who didn't believe they'd die, who couldn't have. How else can you have a good time? How else can you live? There must have been 2 men kissing for the first time last night, and for the last, and 2 women too, and 2 people who were neither. Brown people, which cannot be a coincidence in this country, which is a racist country, which is gun country. Today I'm thinking of the Bernie Boston photograph, Flower Power, of the Vietnam protester placing carnations in the rifles of the National Guard and wishing for a gesture as queer and simple. The protester in the photo was gay, you know. He went by hibiscus and died of AIDS, which I am also thinking about today because the government's response to AIDS was a hate crime. Now we have a president who names us, the big and imperfectly lettered us, and here we are getting kissed on stoops, getting married, some of us getting killed. We must love one another whether or not we die. Love can't block a bullet, but neither can it be shot down. And love is, for the most part, what makes us. In Orlando, in Brooklyn, in Kabul. We will be everywhere, always. There's nowhere else for us or you to go. Anywhere you run in this world, love will be there to greet you. Around any corner, there might be 2 men kissing. The second poem has, as all these poems do, a beautiful response. This by John Groweiler. It ends, this poem is a response to Christopher Soto. It ends, Soto's poem reminds us that in spite of the grief we carry from the attacks on our body, a powerful grace exists, both in the act of loving and in the act of having love bestowed upon us. Activism is what love looks like in public, which is certainly a beautiful sentiment filled with optimism. All the dead boys look like me, Christopher Soto. Last time I saw myself die is when police killed Jesse Hernandez, a 17-year-old brown queer who was sleeping in their car. Yesterday I saw myself die again. 50 times I died in Orlando, and I remember reading Dr. Jose Esteban Munoz's, when before he passed, I was studying NYU and he was teaching where he wrote shit that made me feel like a queer brown survival was possible, but he didn't survive, and now on the dance floor, in the restroom, on the news, in my chest, there are another 50 bodies that look like mine and are dead. And I have been marching for Black lives and talking about the police brutality against Native communities too for years now. But this morning, I feel it. I really feel it again. How can we imagine ourselves, we being Black, Native, today, brown people, how can we imagine ourselves when all the dead boys look like us? Once I asked my nephew where he wanted to go to college, what career he would like, as if the whole world was his for the choosing. Once he answered me without fearing tombstones or cages, or the hands from a father, the hands of my lover yesterday praised my whole body, made the angels from my lips, Ave Maria, full of grace. He propped me up like the roof of a cathedral in New York City, before we opened the news and read about people who think 2 brown queers cannot build cathedrals, only cemeteries. And each time we kiss, a funeral plot opens. In the bedroom, I accept his kiss and I lose my reflection. I'm tired of writing this poem, but I want to say one last word about yesterday. My father called. I heard him cry for only the second time in my life. He sounded like he loved me. It's something I am rarely able to hear. And I hope, if anything, his sound is what my body remembers first.
Thanks, Toby. My name is Cameron McGill. Alexandra, thank you for having me and for putting this together. I'm going to honored to read a poem by Ross Gay, which is titled The Bullet in Its Hunger. The bullet in its hunger craves the womb of the body. The warm thrum there begs always release from the chilly, dumb chamber. Look at this one whose glee at escape was outshone only by the heavens above him, the night's even-keeled breath. All things thus far dreams from his cramped bunker, but now the world. Let me be a ravenous diamond in it, he thinks, chewing through the milky jawbone of this handsome 17-year-old. Of course he would love to nestle amidst the brain's scintillant catacombs, which only for the boy's dumb luck slipped away, but this will do. The bullet does not, as the boy goes into shock or as his best friend stutters, palming the fluid wound, want to know the nature of the conflict, nor the sound of the shooter's mother in prayer, nor the shot child's future harmonies, the tracheotomy's muffled wheeze threaded through the pencil's whisper as the boy scrawls, "I'm scared." No. The bullet, like you, simply craves the warmth of the body. Like you, only wants to die in someone's arms.
First of all, I want to thank Alexandra for all her work on this utmost important issues and for editing this volume. Thank you to all the poets for bringing their art to the service of social change, and thank you to Stacy, Tobias, and Cameron, and as well as all the other readers that will come after me for giving voice to such powerful words. My name is Melanie Neuilly. In the interest of full disclosure, I am a gun owner. But I'm also, and most importantly for tonight, I think, a criminologist who studies violence at Washington State University. Today, I'm going to be discussing the culture in which this violence occurs. It is not my goal to dwell on numbers or offer practical advice here. I know others from the Brady campaign will do it after me. But first, let me briefly set the stage with a few facts. 40% of American households own guns, the highest proportion of the Western world. Collectively, those 40% of American households own 300 million guns, enough to arm every single American. Overall, the number of gun owners has declined since the 1950s. But the number of guns owned has gone up. And while the most prevalent explanation for gun ownership used to be hunting, it is now protection. So what's going on? Every year I take students abroad to learn about other countries' criminal justice systems, and every year they are baffled by how the rest of the Western world views guns. I was born in France, and so for the longest time, Americans' loves for their guns baffled me. So we have to understand the gun culture in the United States within its broader context, within its historical heritage of an individualist culture of violence and oppression. When my students encounter unarmed British police officers or unguarded Dutch palaces, they ponder about safety. They're beguiled by the apparent trust that all will be good and well. Indeed, there can be no trust or safety in a country whose very foundation rests on a breach of trust and the subsequent annihilation and subjugation of entire peoples and lands. The romanticizing of the pioneering ethos of individualism and self-reliance in a Western harsh environment exemplifies how gun violence has deeply integrated in American identity and culture. We find ourselves at a momentous time in history. In 2008, we elected our first black president, and in 2016, we came quite close to electing our first woman president. Some might even say that we, in fact, did. The country is increasingly diverse, and it will not be long until whites no longer hold the statistical majority, and white men no longer are the sole holders of power. As we wait for 2042, to borrow the words of comedian Harry Kunabulu, the ghosts of our past come to haunt us as the date approaches when the racial balance in the United States is projected to flip. Our legacy of racism rears its ugly head. It was during Obama's presidency that gun owners started stockpiling weapons, which is, by the way, not when we bought a gun. We bought it during another presidential election. It was also during his presidency that the justification for owning a gun switched from hunting to protection. In a country where whites have long established their supremacy through the mistreatment of non-whites, shifts in power and demographics are met with violence. Interestingly, the modern debate about the open carrying of firearms was first initiated in the 1960s by the Black Panther movement, who had asserted their right to defend themselves after routinely being victimized by racist police and white vigilantes. Back then, the National Rifle Association was opposing the display of firearm, and Ronald Reagan, as governor of California, signed some of the most stringent gun control legislation of that era. He was, of course, shot and nearly murdered by a white gun owner almost 2 decades later. Another realization my students face when in Europe is what they perceive as leniency of the justice systems there. When they express their doubts about the effectiveness of such approaches, their comments are met with shrugs. There is no need, they're told. Rehabilitation is more important than punishment. Offenders are humans and have rights too. Violence in the United States is a constant state of being, perpetrated by individuals and institutions alike. Places where justice goes beyond revenge to serve the common good are seen as soft. Conceiving of a world in which others are not our enemies is unthinkable until you encounter it. Now, far from me to establish Europe as a bastion of communitarian equality, it has its own sets of problems, including a shared responsibility in America's original sin. But it does fare better than the United States with regard to violence, and we might do well to look there for inspiration. Interestingly enough, Americans are not just some of the most violent first world inhabitants, but also some of the least traveled. In these unprecedented times of ours, when fear is stoked and the perceived other is ostracized and scapegoated, as we saw in Charlottesville, and also sadly in our own communities, I wish I could see on more faces the look I see on my students' faces at the end of their experience abroad. The look of people who have been exposed to otherness and have realized there is nothing to fear. The look of people who just discovered that it might just be all good and well after all, if only we confront our fears and limitations and trust others not to bring us harm. While not a practical policy recommendation, a cultural change is what we need. Thank you.
is a black poet born in Maryland, Baltimore, 1956. In 1993, he wrote a great book called Stations in a Dream, which is a book about Marc Chagall's paintings. It's one of the first books of poetry I ever read. And one of his rhetorical gifts as a poet is talking about violence without talking about it. And in it, he explores what it is to be a black man writing about a Jewish man's art without ever saying so. It's a beautiful testimony to being a human being. This poem is called Something It's Taken 30 Years to Write. The door popped open, the bud to yield soft petals from stems tied to stalks in the dirt, unpainted rails up under the porch, broken stock of promise made before the time to drive over to the 19th hole for a drink. The bar where the cowboys break open swinging doors to sprawl in the street, to sell card games with jealous blubbering over glasses of Johnny Walker Red. Now, it is this popping open. The slack breaking down of two empty pipes where shells go like torpedoes, this time the water a kind of air where children split apart, the sea opened by no kind God, but the angry spit of death determined to kill a day in spring, to mark it with the pop of shells bursting in twin tubes of a shotgun here on Milton Avenue, where there is a church that remembers the tilt of Easter hats, the black is proud debate, that questioned the blondness of a thin Jesus, too white for love now. One young black man killing another, an afternoon when longshoremen changed shifts on Key Highway, filing across the street by the hundreds, with lunches sliding through their small intestines or lodged up somewhere in the colon, the stomach emptying for what will come at home with the ball game playing, as if there were no unique day anywhere. Except now, in this lifting away, the popping of a shotgun falls inside the whistle of cargo trains heading west, under shrill wishes of seagulls with invisible feathers.
Hi everybody, my name's Kat Lewis. I'm a third year in the poetry program here at U of I, and it was especially important for me to read at this tonight just because any connection, any view I had on violence and gun violence was largely shaped from the perspective of the law enforcer. My father was the warden of the highest maximum security prison in California for 5 years, and that did shape a lot of the ways I view the world, but it's also why I'm here today. And so thank you, Alexandra, for allowing me the space to do this. This poem is called The Leash by Ada Limon. After the birthing of bombs, of forks and fear, the frantic automatic weapons unleashed, the spray of bullets into a crowd holding hands, that brute sky opening in a slate metal maw that swallows only the unsayable in each of us. What's left? Even the hidden nowhere river is poisoned orange and acidic by a coal mine. How can you not fear humanity, want to lick the creek bottom dry, to suck the deadly water up into your own lungs like venom? Reader, I want to say, don't die. Even when silvery fish after fish comes back belly up, and the country plummets into a crepitating crater of hatred, isn't there still something singing? The truth is, I don't know. But sometimes I swear I hear it, the wound closing, like a rusted-over garage door, and I can still move my living limbs into the world without too much pain, can still marvel at how the dog runs straight towards the pickup trucks, breaknecking down the road, because she thinks she loves them, because she's sure, without a doubt, that the loud, roaring things will love her back, her soft, small self, alive with desire to share her goddamn enthusiasm, until I yank the leash back to save her, because I want her to survive forever. Don't die, I say, and we decide to walk for a bit longer, starlings high and fevered above us, winter coming to lay her cold corpse down upon this little plot of earth. Perhaps we are always hurtling our body towards the thing that will obliterate us, begging for love from the speeding passage of time. And so maybe, like the dog obedient at my heels, we can walk together peacefully, at least until the next truck comes.
My name's Corey, and I'm going to read a Bob Hickok poem called Throwing a Lifeline. Say you're a professor and one of your students shot and killed 32 people. Say it's years later. Fall's begun, and kids have that eager look of tulips in their faces, of green life pushing up from the ground towards sun. In the smile of one passing, you see the joy of one who passed, one of the 32, and follow her with your imagination. You give her life in a poem by having her run along a beach, her children behind her and their grandparents behind them, everyone wanting dinner, everyone wanting stars to come out and be their silly, shiny selves, everyone wanting that next little breath. But let me ask, are you drinking again? Have you driven your car into a tree? Do you have a suicide note for a heart? Do you wake on the wrong side of the bed, the bottom, not the top? Say you're so desperate for gun control that you're thinking of appealing to conservatives by suggesting that murder is abortion when one considers the children this woman was likely to have had. The children you just gave her in your poem, but are in danger of killing if you let your anger take that political turn. Don't do it. Don't you see that poems make horrible legislation, and even worse, bulletproof vests so brittle and thin-skinned? Just let her live. Let her run with the kite of her children behind her. That's what I'd do if I were you. And the drinking, the driving into trees, I'd do those too. I'd drink and crash and write one poem for every day of her life. Hell, I'd drink more and crash better and write too.
Hi, great crowd. Thank you all for being here. And thank you especially to Alexandra for inviting us to be part of this. I'm Curran with the Latah County chapter of the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence. And it's been amazing to hear these powerful poems and the strong voices of the readers, so thank you all for that. I bought this book yesterday, I'm about halfway through it, and there was one response that particularly spoke to my heart and what I do with the Latah County Brady chapter. Response to my mother contemplating her gun, from Ashlyn Melton, bereaved mother of Noah James Daigle, age 13. Life is precious. God decided when we would be born. Unfortunately, sometimes man decides when we will die. My son, Noah Daigle, had a purpose in life. He was an absolute joy and was destined for great things. No worries at the tender age of 13. But in 1 second, a dumb decision destroyed his life and the lives of all of us who are left on earth to grieve. One irresponsible, not thought out action by a child ended Noah's life on December 30th, 2011. Others refer to it as an accident. Don't call it an accident. That undermines all I try to do in sharing his story. It was a negligent incident. It was free will. It was a choice made by his friend. A choice to pick up an unsecured, unlocked gun. A choice that will stay with me all the rest of my days. The Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence quickly realized that these types of tragic deaths were happening too frequently. It seemed normal for children to lose their lives this way, and they wanted to do something about that. They started Ask Day, Asking Saves Kids, which is June 21st of each year. The purpose is to encourage people to ask about guns and gun storage in every home your child visits. Ask, And then you make the choice if you think your child will be safe in that home. Don't do what I did. Don't be naive in thinking that your child is being watched the way you would watch them. The reality is they're not always safe. I didn't ask, and now I visit my child at the graveyard. Of all the work that we do towards gun violence prevention in our community, I feel the Asking Saves Kids program is one of the most important. The past 2 years, we have also done the Officer New Bill Kids Safety Fair, providing information about the ASK program, safe storage, and handing out free cable locks we get from our police department. We also bring the Ask message to the farmers market, along with information on suicide-proofing your home and Speak Up, a way that students can anonymously report weapons threats. Please stop by for more information at our table. We also have a sign-up sheet for our quarterly newsletter and action alerts, so please stop by and help keep the Latah County chapter going strong. Thank you.
I'm Gretchen Wisner, and it's been my pleasure to work with Curran and with Ginger Rankin, who got our Latah Brady chapter started, and with other members of our chapter. I realize as I've been listening to these powerful poetry and responses that what touched me as I was processing the recent Las Vegas shooting, was the response of several journalists to that event. One of them being Nicholas Kristof, and quite a bit of what's on the display here is a result of the research that he gathered in response to that. So I'm going to read kind of a summary of some of that article and another one. The statistics on gun-related violence in this country are stunning. According to David Hemingway of Harvard University, since 1970, more Americans have died from guns, including suicides, murders, and accidents, than the sum total of all Americans who died in all the wars in American history back to the American Revolution. Every day, some 92 Americans die from guns, and American kids are 14 times as likely to die from guns as children in other developed countries. While mass shootings shock and then motivate temporary discussion of gun safety measures, they actually represent a very small percentage of gun deaths in this country. In 2016, 456 people died in mass shootings. Horrible, but that represents only 1.2% of all gun deaths. Almost 12,000 were homicides and 22,000 were suicides. In addition, an average of 81,000 people, including 14,000 children and teens, survive gun injuries each year. According to a 2007 Small Arms Research Survey, which was reported by the Congressional Research Service, Americans own nearly half, 48%, of the estimated 650 million civilian-owned guns in the world. Yet, we represent 5% of the world's population. This survey places the number at 89 guns per 100 people. Switzerland is a distant second with a little over half that number. England, ranked 10th, comes in at 6.2, and Japan at 0.6 guns per 100 people. It is not surprising that we also lead the world in gun murders. 4 times that of Italy, ranked 2nd, 6 times that of Canada, ranked 3rd, and 30 times that of Australia, England, France, and Spain. Japan reported no gun murders during 2016. The problem of gun violence in this country is multifaceted and has been difficult to address, but there are solutions. A first step is to better fund gun research to help us determine what are in fact the causes of and deterrents to violence. The University of Chicago Crime Lab provides a list of the American toll from 4 diseases and firearms over a 40-year span from 1973 to 2012. And then they compared that toll with the number of National Institute of Health research grants to explore each problem over that same time. For rabies, 89 grants were awarded, with 65 cases reported over that time period. 129 grants were awarded for polio research, with 266 cases reported. 212 for cholera with 400 cases reported, 56 grants for diphtheria with 1,337 cases. And I don't want to diminish the importance of research in any of these areas, but there were only 3 grants awarded by the National Institute of Health to study over 4 million gun-related injuries. 3 grants. Nicholas Kristof, who's the author, one of the journalists I spoke of earlier, of the New York Times, makes 8 specific suggestions that he thinks have the potential to reduce gun deaths by nearly 1/3, with an emphasis on addressing gun violence as a public health issue. He points out that we have a model for regulating the purchase and use of guns, and that is the measures that we've put in place since the 1950s to improve vehicle safety. They have had a significant impact, reducing deaths per 100 million miles traveled from 9.1 to 1.2. Adam Winkler, writing for the LA Times, states that nearly 2/3 of Americans support stricter gun control laws, but they are less politically active than gun owners. We often wonder what it will take for Congress to shake loose the grasp of the NRA, and maybe this is where the answer lies, when American voters finally care enough to make it an issue. If you want to know more, please stop by our table for a conversation or one of our handouts. And thank you again, Alexandra, for your work.
And also, when you stop by our table, we do have a sign-up sheet, and you can join our mailing list. We send out a quarterly newsletter and action alerts, but we're also looking for active volunteers. And so there, towards the end of it, there's a space where you can say, yes, I'd like to volunteer, and to the right, there's a list of volunteer opportunities that we have. In particular, we're looking for a new Facebook administrator. So thank you for listening, and please stop by our table.
Hello, everybody. My name is Caitlin Curran. I'm a second-year MFA student in poetry here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Alexandra. I'll be reading Ocean Vuong and also the prose response afterward. This is Always and Forever by Ocean Vuong. Open this when you need me most, he said, as he slid the shoebox wrapped in duct tape beneath my head. His thumb, still damp from the shutter between mother's thighs, kept circling the mole above my brow. The devil's eye blazed between his teeth, or was he lighting a joint? It doesn't matter. Tonight I wake and mistake the bathwater wrung from mother's hair for his voice. I open the shoebox dusted with 7 winters, and here, sunk in folds of yellowed newspaper, lies the Colt 45, silent and heavy as an amputated hand. I hold the gun and wonder if an entry wound in the night would make a hole wide as morning. That if I looked through it, I would see the end of this sentence. Or maybe just a man kneeling at the boy's bed, his gray overalls reeking of gasoline and cigarettes. Maybe the day will close without the page turning as he wraps his arm around the boy's milk blue shoulders. The boy pretending to be asleep as his father's clutch tightens. The way the barrel, aimed at the sky, must tighten around a bullet to make it speak. So this is the response to Always and Forever from Cly Lasher Summers, who is a fellow of Everytown for Gun Safety. I tell you this, there is no language for night bullets. My stepfather shot me with a .306 hunting rifle when I was 13 years old on the coldest of nights in January in 1970. It cut and sliced its way through my back, leaving shrapnel that still leaves my body. The force ruined a kidney and shocked the nerves in my spine so that I could not walk for months. I resist the language of the telling of being shot. Really, this is it. The truth of gun violence in domestic violence. First, he beat my mother and brother. Then, as I became the protector of my family, he took to chasing me along the Connecticut River with his gun and his dog. He leaned in to rape me, and I resisted with fury only available to the knowing of a child. He would take that gun and hang me from a wall night after night. Metal below the chin and pinned. I sit with parents now who have had their child shot. I see the wild-eyed terror of their children the seconds before they were shot. It is a terror so visceral that I must tell the truth.
Good evening. My name is Cindy. When I first met Martina Spada earlier this year, he said that we're in for a battle and poets will lead the way. This book is certainly proof of that, Alexandra. I'm reading his poem, Heal the Cracks in the Bell of the World. It begins with a dedication. For the community of Newton, Connecticut, where 20 students and 6 educators lost their lives to a gunman at Sandy Hook Elementary School, December 14, 2012. Now the bells speak with their tongues of bronze. Now the bells open their mouths of bronze to say, listen to the bells a world away. Listen to the bell and ruins of a city where children gathered copper shells like beach glass. And the copper boiled in the foundry, and the bell born in the foundry says, I was born of bullets, but now I sing of a world where bullets melt into bells. Listen to the bell in a city where cannons from the armies of the Great War sank into molten metal, bubbling like a vat of chocolate, and the many mouths that once spoke the tongue of smoke form the one mouth of a bell that says, I was born of cannons, but now I sing of a world where cannons melt into bells. Listen to the bells in a town with a flagpole on Main Street, a rooster weather vane keeping watch atop the meeting house, the congregation gathering to sing in times of great silence. Hear the bells rock their heads of bronze as if to say, melt the bullets into bells, melt the bullets into bells. Hear the bells raise their heavy heads as if to say, melt the cannons into bells, melt the cannons into bells. Hear the bells sing of a world where the weapons crumble deep in the earth and no one remembers where they were buried. Now the bells pass the word at midnight in the ancient language of bronze. From bell to bell, like ships smuggling news of liberation from island to island, the song rippling through the clouds. Now the bells chime like the muscle beating in every chest. Heal the cracks in the bell of every face listening to the bells. The chimes heal the cracks in the bell of the moon. The chimes heal the cracks in the bell of the world.
Hi, excuse me. I'm Bob Wrigley. And I also want to thank Alexandra and Dean and Brian for what they've done in assembling this book. We are witnessing an act of citizens' responsibility. We are all responsible. We are all responsible. This poem is dedicated to Mark Solomon. Some of you know Mark. He's an important Moscow citizen, lives on top of Moscow Mountain. And if you go and type in your Google box, Peace Art Cambodia Project, you will see some of the works of art spoken of in this poem. Kalashnikov Candelabrum. There being no art supplies in the nation, the government of Cambodia donated thousands of decommissioned Kalashnikovs to the visiting artists. And it was with those death machines disassembled, bent, reshaped from what they were into what they were not, that they taught the children to make flowers, chairs, and tables, elephants, miraculous fish, and other miraculous beasts, as well as this elegant black steel candelabrum, brought all the way from Cambodia to a mountaintop in Idaho, from its relentless fire to these 5 mild candles, burning again and again and again and again and yet again for our lost American lives. Thank you.
Thank you all again for coming tonight. Please stay around for conversations, to look at the information, to hug one another. Thank you. This is a beautiful community.